Hello, welcome all you lovely politicos out there and to another episode of Bingley Talks Politics. And we have decided to be a little bit more specific this week. We will probably mention the current state of affairs in a kind of way later on in the podcast. But we're going to talk about someone who many people have either perhaps not heard of, or if they have, they don't know too much about him. And then we're going to try and make our talk about him sort of relevant for today and a few other things as well. And the person who, and I'm surrounded by, well, the two people that I'm surrounded by, if that's not a contradiction in terms, do know quite a lot about this person. It's Ramsay MacDonald. Which direction should I go? I'll go to Mr. Cook first. Briefly, Ramsay MacDonald.
Fine, brief.
Who is he?
Who is he? Who was he?
Who was he? Sorry, yeah.
Well, he was the first Labour Prime Minister, so most people will say Clement Attlee, and it's understandable why. He is,
but they're wrong.
Yeah, they're wrong. But he's also, to be fair, Attlee is obviously the most transformational, one of the most transformational Labour leaders going. But he was preceded by Ramsay MacDonald. He was born in October 1866. Ramsay MacDonald. He really, together with people like George Lansbury, Arthur Henderson, J.H. Thomas, trade union figures, they created the Labour Party, as it was known. Started off, I think, as the ILP, the Independent Labour Party, and then eventually that kind of...
When was Labour created? 1897, was it? Something like that?
1900, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's like... The exact date is difficult to pinpoint, but it's around 1900, yeah.
So it was a movement, essentially, and then a political party and things like that.
Yeah.
What about MacDonald's Prime Minister? When did he become Prime Minister?
So he becomes Prime Minister in 1924, first time. Just briefly before then, though, he comes to prominence in World War I because he's one of the few MPs in Parliament to speak out against Britain's intervention in the First World War on the grounds of workers' solidarity and stuff like that.
Does he remain consistent on that?
Yeah, he remains consistent, and he's ostracised from not just Labour but the entire political establishment throughout the 1914 to 20 period, basically. And he's basically cast off as a nobody, and then he makes a spectacular comeback in the early 1920s, wins this by-election in, I think it's Seaham, up in Scotland area. And he wins the election in 24 against Stanley Baldwin. It's not a majority government, though. It's still a minority administration.
Can we steady? To talk us through how he becomes an outsider for a time. So you mentioned he manages to get up for election and wins the by-election.
Yeah.
But then he seems to then he's fighting an election against Baldwin. How do we go from that to pretty quickly be in contention to be winning an election?
Yeah, well, but MacDonald is, we'll get onto this later with comparisons with later Prime Ministers, but he is seen these days as kind of a latter-day Blair. If you look at MacDonald's speeches and you look at testimonies of people that went to public gatherings, apparently it was just spectacular. There was no one at the time that could measure against him. Baldwin, as good as a public speaker he was, MacDonald, because of how vague he was, MacDonald, and how he would appeal to grand, kind of religious concepts a lot of the time. And this is interesting about his belief system at this time. It's not trade union socialism, it's more like ethical socialism. There's a massively religious undercurrent to people like him and Philip Snowden's form of socialism.
Was he ideological? Is that how
I'm going to save that for...
We're going to save that for a bit.
Event,
yeah, okay.
But at this time, it's interesting because he's viewed as not as an ideologue by the trade unionists, but a lot of the more moderate elements of Labour would vehemently disagree with that, probably. But so through his rhetoric, essentially, and his familiarity...
That's one of his main strengths, then,
that is probably his greatest, and some would argue only strength, really, as we'll probably discuss later. But he goes up against Baldwin. Baldwin's...
What year are we in now?
Well, the election's in 23.
Right.
Baldwin runs on it's December 23. It's the only other December election.
100 years ago. It's the anniversary.
And it's the only other December election we've had since 2019 as well.
Right, okay.
Yeah. So Baldwin goes to the polls in December on a platform of protectionism, tariffs. At the time, this is incredibly unpopular in Britain. Baldwin completely misjudges the public mood and the Tories get kicked out of office and lose what Burnout Law won the previous year in 22, quite a nice majority of them. And MacDonald comes in. He's propped up by the Liberals at this point. Not the Liberal Democrats, the foreigner to them, basically. Asquith's still leader. He's back from his illness. And Baldwin essentially does some manoeuvring, and Asquith supports MacDonald's administration. This backfires on the Liberals, who are viewed as propping up socialism, giving it a chance, and then by the time you get to late 24, Baldwin's back in power again. So the first ever Labour government lasts around about 9 months.
Could be worse.
Could be worse, yeah.
But not much.
But not much. It was quite a bad year for
you would hope that, obviously, to make a better start and have slightly longer at it. Okay. And that's because of, well, the things you've mentioned, really. That they're working together with the Liberals. It's more difficult, as we know. And socialism is still a relatively new, certainly mainstream political concept, if you like, at the time, and maybe that comes with a few issues as well.
Yeah, having said this, though, by the time you get to the late 24 election, Labour's vote share hardly even changes. It's not so much a collapse in support for Labour that kicks MacDonald out of office, it's more so the Tories essentially cannibalising the Liberal vote, or beginning to cannibalise the Liberal vote in this period, and that's when you start seeing the decline of the Liberals.
Okay.
So Labour's still popular after its first government.
So that next election kind of marks the we can start to, probably happened before, didn't it? But we can start to see, because it's sort of, most people understand the Liberals must have demised at some point, and it starts then, doesn't it? And so we see that in that next election when Baldwin manages to win. So the Conservatives come back to power.
Yeah, 24.
What does MacDonald do then?
MacDonald goes back into opposition. He's not really... He's viewed as a good opposition leader, but he fails to kind of hold the government to account. And this is quite ominous and important given later developments. His suspicions start to grow about the extent to which MacDonald is actually sympathetic with the Tories' policies on a lot of stuff, on industrial affairs and all. When the general strike kicks off in 26, for instance, Labour, it's less so the Labour leadership that's criticising the government and more so the trade union movement, people like Ernie Bevan.
So as you suggested, is this his lack of potentially ideological clarity coming through and allowing him some flexibility, but also creating problems?
Yeah, and there's a lot of different interpretations of why MacDonald is this way and is a bit more conciliated to the Tories than you might expect. So he's born in Lossiemouth, which is really, it's like way up in the Highlands of Scotland, basically, and at the time it was very rugged conditions. He was an illegitimate child as well, and this was leaked during World War One and completely followed him throughout the rest of his career, and he was at the time completely ridiculed for it, essentially. There were awful articles written about him, but there's always been this idea...
Illegitimate to the extent, what, he was born outside wedlock?
Yeah. Now, today that's literally, nothing wrong with that whatsoever, but back then this was genuine.
And it did become a thing that he couldn't get rid of.
Yeah, it followed him all throughout the rest of his life.
Interesting.
And there was this idea he had a bit of a chip on his shoulder, but that came with also kind of coveting the halls of power and the rubbing shoulders with elites and stuff like that. So there's a conspiracy that starts to develop from 24 to 29, which is that MacDonald is essentially not holding the government to account because he sympathises with a lot of their policies. So
he's leader of the opposition.
Yeah, 24 to 29.
But there's question marks over how effectively...
Yeah, the trade unions
does that.
Getting quite concerned.
Kind of country is Britain at the time?
Well, 24 to 29, Britain's interwar period, right? So we class that as essentially from, even though the war ends in 1919, it's 1920, right? 1920 to 39, the interwar period. It's characterised by mass unemployment. This is an issue that really ticks off in 29 when the Wall Street crash hits.
Yeah.
Prior to that, a lot of the emphasis is... Well, the main current within elections is anti-socialism. Like you said, it's a new concept. It's not been tested. You've had the Liberals that have implemented a lot of impressive social reform for the time, but you've never had a government that's come to power backed by the trade unions entirely, funded by them, and also promising things or hinting at things like debt financing, which today, the idea of the government running a budget deficit is fairly normal. But back then, even in the 20s, this is viewed as an incredibly radical departure because of the gold standard, right? Sterling's still pegged to the gold standard. It's got to keep parity.
I mean, Britain still has, or is clinging... Well, I mean, technically, its empire is still pretty big at the time.
Yes. It was its largest at
this
point.
It was, wasn't it? Yeah. However, there are clearly cracks widening all the time, I think, is not a hugely controversial statement, i.e. it's going to struggle to keep it for much longer, but there's still that is still Britain, isn't it?
Yeah.
Britain and its empire. Let me just switch over to Finn here. Ramsay MacDonald, I don't know how much you know about him before he becomes I mean, what are you thinking of him as, you know, in that particular period or just before? Do you know much about his life before he becomes the first Labour PM?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of, I think the fact that he came from, as you say, Lossiemouth, peasant, and when you look at his cabinet in his final government in the 1930s, and you see, there was almost, I was thinking this morning, was social mobility better then? Because they were all workers, they were all, you know, I think Philip Snowden, he came from Cowling, didn't he, which is just up the road from here. And so, yeah, so for MacDonald, his personal mission, as with the rest of the Labour Party, was to give the Labour Party credibility, to say that we can be in government, to defy this anti-socialist rhetoric, and, you know, that kind of built up.
Are we thinking then, just to paint a picture, so do these things matter to MacDonald and form his character and his leadership as he is leader of the opposition, and then we'll get on to his prime ministership soon? His birth and childhood and the idea of him being illegitimate, his stance in World War One and ostracism, as you put it, and becoming an outsider he strikes me as he's going to need a lot of resilience, determination. He spoke of him as being an effective orator. Am I characterising him right here? He's got that. He's using those things that seem to differentiate him as a bit of momentum and motivation.
Yeah, I've just finished my literature review on him, so I'm going to do the full-on academic thing and say there's two sides of interpretation here, basically. You've got the older works, like David Marquand, who argue, you know, yeah, MacDonald was, like you said, been trying to basically moderate Labour. That was his core intention, right? Get Labour into government, and then the dominating policy vision then is to not rock the boat and appear safe and creditable to people. But then you've got more critical biographers that tend to draw on the accounts at the time, so like Philip Snowden, Henderson, and they argue they didn't care one bit about making Labour electable. He cared about Ramsay MacDonald and getting into power so that his own ego felt assuaged, basically. This boy who was born in such lowly conditions rising to the top of, you know, the apex of the cabinet. It was all about him. And there's debates essentially between or my interpretation, maybe all these factors interplayed with each other at once, right? And maybe he was constantly dealing with all three of them. Maybe, you know, he probably did have a chip on his shoulder, but also probably was aware that Labour needed to moderate itself, but likewise didn't possess the militant socialism of the trade unions.
Is the criticism or the interpretation of him as a self-interested politician who, you know, is largely or purely out for himself and it's all about his own ego and status? I'm not saying it would be jealousy on the part of historians, but are they perhaps potentially giving too much weight to a sort of critical view of MacDonald because people were critical of him, or am I just is there quite a lot of documentation to suggest that no? I mean, he really did think about himself a lot.
Well, I think we should use that to move on to his next government.
Go on then.
In 29.
Yeah, so, lovely segue. That's great.
Yeah,
it's almost as if you
practice.
Yeah.
So yeah, Baldwin's re-elected late 24. This is essentially begins a period of Tory dominance, right, within the interwar period, which probably sounds like a contradiction because we're about to talk about MacDonald's second government, but we'll get to it. So an election's called in 29. The Tories lose it for a variety of reasons. There's a lot of Baldwin's had a lot of party management issues around India, funnily enough, in the 20s. Diehards like Churchill, who I think is back in the Tories at this point, because I know they went to the Liberals. But so the Tories lose because they're viewed as quite internal disputes going on and factionalism. And MacDonald is elected finally as the first majority Labour government. This is the first time Labour gets a proper independent
What's the majority?
Remember? I can't remember. It's small. It's not big. It's, you know, we're talking about like 12 to 19 maybe. And, you know, Labour's very optimistic. Yes, we've got an independent majority. We don't have to kowtow to the Liberals here. We don't have to listen to the Tories. We don't have to negotiate with anyone. We can implement proper socialism. And 29, you know, throughout 29 they have a lot of foreign policy successes, so they renegotiate debt management and stuff like that. Philip Snowden, who's the Chancellor, an incredibly monumental figure in British politics, especially on the left throughout this period. He's Chancellor. He's starting to increase benefits, unemployment benefits, pensions, stuff like that, and reduce contributions to these systems. But then the Wall Street crash hits, right, in the late 29, and it completely throws up the entire political chessboard in Britain, essentially. MacDonald, the cabinet throughout throughout basically October 29, August, September, October 29, you've got a series of frantic negotiations and debt pillars, essentially, across the political parties, with the Bank of England and international bankers from America and France and stuff. Mm-hmm. The Labour cabinet, puts forward proposals to cut public spending massively and raise income tax massively. The one issue that more left-wing cabinet ministers have with the proposals are the cuts to what's called the dole, the unemployment benefit, which is a relatively new policy at this time in Britain. It's not popular, especially it's not popular among the middle class, who view it as they're paying out essentially in taxes to keep people eating bread and, you know, safe and comfortable. Back then it's not got the same acceptance that it does now, basically. MacDonald puts an ultimatum to his cabinet colleagues with Snowden. Snowden teams up with him, as does J.H. Thomas, and they all say basically, right, you can either get out and resign, or we can all sign off on this package. If you do resign, I'll go to the palace and I'll also resign, and this Labour government will be done. And Henderson and his colleagues say, we're done, we're not going to support it. The Trades Union Council votes against it, the National Executive Committee votes against the proposals. Basically, the entire movement is against these proposals. MacDonald goes to the palace and is either, this is an interesting debate we won't spend too much time on, but whether it's King George or MacDonald who first proposes the idea of a national government, a cross-party government between MacDonald, the Tories and the Liberals. So, in terms of his reputation and whether or not it's a fair characterisation, I think a lot of the reputation stuff that came after his premierships were because of this event. It's the formation of the national government. It's the election that's then fought in October 31 on the platform of a doctor's mandate. Now, MacDonald, I think it's an ingenious conception, this doctor's mandate. The national government goes to the country asking for a mandate to do whatever they deem necessary within the circumstances. It's not a policy-specific programme. It's essentially gets to the core of proportional representation. It's this idea, if you elect us and we'll do whatever we deem necessary, put your trust in us. Me, MacDonald, very charismatic, you know, very good on the cameras. Baldwin, the man you can trust, right? All these, Herbert Samuel, the leader of the Liberals, all these great figures in British politics come together and form this national government, which is, you know, is a really interesting coalition in Britain's history, but it's never really spoken about.
I mean, sort of about the 1931 crisis. So I've read around a bit on this, but I was always under the impression that from the start, when they started negotiations, after obviously there was a big deficit, they were all, the Labour Party and the cabinet was all agreed that we had to get this down. And Henderson, as well as the trade unions, Henderson anyway, he was agreed, right, we need to put up income tax. But it was all when it came to the unemployment benefit, that was the thing. And then Henderson was still kind of agreeing with the policy of reducing the benefit, but he thought, well, I need to preserve the Labour movement, because if we put this through, then Labour will be dead. And MacDonald was more pragmatic and believed in national duty and thought it doesn't matter about the party. And then, I suppose, one of my conclusions that I did in my project on MacDonald, which I really liked and you got me onto actually, was that for MacDonald it was kind of like the murder of his own child that he'd brought up through so many elections, and that he had to sacrifice that for national duty, which I think, in terms of lessons for modern day Britain, I think that's...
Well, there were quite a few when you were both talking there that I was thinking about with how it does resonate today. Just even I know we've not really... I mean, that's just getting started with his... Well, it doesn't last that long, does it, really? But, well, you know, I mean, just before we go into that, is it a sense that he's got the problem because he's the Labour leader? Whereas if a Conservative leader did that, it's like, well, yeah, of course you would, because that's the most sensible thing to do, and it will shore up our electoral mandate, and, you know, because they are an effective winning machine. Labour have that issue, don't they? Of you've got to keep a sense of ideological purity or stick to, and whilst yes, that might be the right thing, I don't know, or certainly admirable with many people, it does cause issues. Is that a situation where this is happening?
Well, if a Labour government's in power, what's the first thing you look to for the record? Social policy, right? It's what their followers expect. It's what
So they're always,
expect.
in a way, judged more harshly than maybe.
To an extent, right? Yeah. It's like you said. If there was the only person within the national government that really got hounded by his own followers for what the policies they did were MacDonald. The Tories were pretty much... The Tories, their only issue was that they weren't having tariffs quicker. That was their main issue. The Liberals had an issue that the Tories wanted tariffs quicker and they wanted to keep free trade. That was the main issues with their parties. But MacDonald, by the time he's Prime Minister, he doesn't actually have a Labour. He has a national Labour following of about 13 MPs after the election. But... his government is... I should probably point this out quickly. The national government isn't really a national government. You've got about 13 to 19 national Labour MPs and about 300 plus, eventually 400 plus Conservative MPs, and then about less than 50 Liberals. So it's essentially a Conservative government with an independent MP as Prime Minister who's formerly Labour, with a small contingent of free trade Liberals that eventually disappear anyway.
So Ramsay MacDonald's leading the Tory party?
Kind of. Yeah. And this is the critique that his followers put forward, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that clearly was. So what happens next then?
So he's Prime Minister. He appoints a new cabinet. Tories overwhelmingly have representation in the cabinet. Baldwin, I think, is made Lord Privy Council, Lord President, is it, the council? The Liberals get quite good. Herbert Samuel becomes, I think, Colonial Secretary, and I think Reading becomes Foreign Secretary. Chamberlain, Philip Snowden.
Oh, still in 30. What year
we're
in
in 30 now.
30, sorry, I think 31, yeah.
Yeah, going to 31. So, Philip Snowden's Chancellor. I should probably note Philip Snowden. There were ways, you might have mentioned it in what you were referencing, Finn, that one of the proposals was instead of a cut to the dole, bringing in a general tariff on imported goods, and Philip Snowden kills the idea. So that immediately makes any compromise difficult on those lines. But the government is popular for the time being, at the beginning. But the issue is that they're still dealing with a Labour opposition that's quite strong. And they want to go to the country to get a mandate to do something. It's not so much a specific policy, but they need to have a departure from the policy, the Overton window, right, that's existed until this point.
Social and economic issues in the country at that time are?
Unemployment is now ticking up year by year.
Yeah.
It's not it's not going down.
Number one problem, unemployment. 100%. So you've got unemployment in the country, and you've got the political problem of getting things done and managed within Westminster and the parties, and obviously the national government, as you've explained it.
Yeah, and you've also then got the crisis in India is also going on throughout all of this. You've still got the political parties arguing about whether India gets dominion status eventually within 10 years, and the Irwin Declaration, whether these things even get implemented, but it's put on hold. Because it's just deadlock at the moment. There's everything's on sterling, everything's on the finances. The biggest first hurdle they hit the national government, which funnily enough they turn into a strength, is sterling being on the gold standard. The government's expressed intention, MacDonald basically publicly states, this is a temporary arrangement. We are not going to fight an election as a national government. We're going to stabilise the finances and keep sterling on the gold standard. Sterling gets kicked off the gold standard, they hold an election, I think it is the biggest landslide majority in British history. It's huge, it's massive. I think it's literally a super majority of, I think Labour's left with 200 and something seats out of 600, so if you do the maths, it's like a 400 seat majority basically. It's mad. And this essentially you'd think would empower MacDonald, you'd think this would essentially allow him to be like, right, I'm going to do what I want, I'm going to sort out India, I'm going to sort out the economy. He just becomes incredibly weak, and this is kind of dovetails his premiership from this point in.
Right. And that was... Yeah, you mentioned it's like this independent MP running. He's almost like a president figure in a way. Is that right? Is that fair? Yeah, I was thinking, should I?
Fantastic way to put it.
Because there's this disconnect with Labour now.
Yeah.
But so the first Labour Prime Minister quite quickly has a disconnect with Labour. I mean, extraordinary, really.
Yeah.
But dictated by the Times and various other things and stuff, and then to have the chutzpah, if that's the best word, or the confidence and the momentum to try and keep that going. I mean, it sounds incredibly difficult.
It does, but he had very able people around him, and this is the interesting thing. So, Stanley Baldwin is an incredibly influential figure in the national government throughout his entire life.
Do they get on?
This is the hilarious, and again, this is where the critiques of betrayal and treason come in, because they get on like a house on fire, Baldwin and MacDonald. They've got a lot of sympathies in common. I think Churchill once said, Baldwin stands for moderate socialism and MacDonald for moderate aristocracy, right? It's this idea that actually they're like two peas in a pod.
Is this a different age? Let's do a quick comparison to now, because that don't happen now, does it, really? I mean, it doesn't, does it? It's not at the moment, anyway. We have a polarisation. We have it's really frayed, isn't it, in the House of Commons? And it might have been that for quite a while, but you don't get the sense that we anywhere close to any sort of collegiality between some of the main leaders, but this seems to be different because of various issues.
Yeah, so, I mean, British politics, like, in this period, with Lloyd George, it's very not consensual. Like, you've got the Asquithian Liberals that hate his guts, and a lot of the Tories who despise him even in coalition with him. But after Lloyd George goes, this period, essentially, consensual politics emerges, where Baldwin and MacDonald are getting on. And that, again, doesn't collapse till Chamberlain comes in 1937. And Chamberlain's much more confrontational, aggressive, rude style against Attlee completely destroys that kind of prospect.
I was actually thinking, I wonder if MacDonald could be likened to Lloyd George when you first started talking about him, because of the oratory, confidence, ego, seen as a bit of an outsider. Lloyd George wasn't necessarily an outsider, but became one, I think, increasingly. I probably know more about him than MacDonald, but
womanizers.
Sorry?
Both womanizers.
Yeah, a lot to throw at them personally. Had to fend that off perhaps throughout their career.
Scottish and Welsh.
So again, sort of outsider status perhaps. So he's still Prime Minister.
Yeah.
But it looks, even though it should be looking good, because of various things, it's difficult.
Yeah, it's kind of sad reading about the reflections on MacDonald at this time. So there's a famous MP from the interwar period called Bob Boothby. Now, he's an incredibly eccentric figure if you read his diaries.
I know of Boothby.
Yeah, he
extraordinary alcohol consumption is one thing I know about him. Also, him and Churchill, I think, used to drink together. You needed a big room, I think, to store it. But anyway, there you go. That's not what we're here to.
But he once found MacDonald. So MacDonald's Prime Minister from 31 after the election in October to 35. And after 35, he stays on for 2 years in the government as Lord President, taking Baldwin. Him and Baldwin swap roles. Baldwin becomes Prime Minister.
I didn't really. I was trying to forget that he stayed till 35. Yeah, it lasted. Is it limping on then, or what's happening? Is that unfair?
So I find this fascinating. This topic. Baldwin takes over in 35. MacDonald's there as Lord President by his side, essentially, into 37. 37 hits. MacDonald goes on a cruise and dies mid-cruise, essentially, on his way to South America. The national government, hilariously, is still called the national government, with a Tory Prime Minister, a Tory majority, and a bunch of protectionist Liberals in it. No Labour anymore. Not even like a National Labour. They're there, but they're not even consulted. They're not in the cabinet or anything like that. And then Chamberlain takes over. Again, people forget Chamberlain was not a leader of a Conservative government. He was leader of the national government until the war. And the tantalising question is, if war hadn't broken out in September 39, Chamberlain manages to go for an appeal in 40. There is a chance. There's no polling at the time, but mass observation is the closest you've got to go off, which is just like a bunch of surveys, essentially, of the people. That it would have won. That it would have essentially won another majority. The question would have been, what would that majority have been focused on? Because the financial crisis has moved on. It would almost certainly have been foreign policy based.
Yeah, we've got the rise of fascism, haven't we? And
this is the
various challenges. Can I just go back? So before 35, how are they governing that? I mean, are we co-leaders then, or I know they're not officially, but is that how it works? Because you said they're getting on well, and Baldwin and MacDonald. How do they run the show?
Yeah, so I brought up Bob Boothby, and this was why I brought Bob Boothby up.
And go back to Boothby,
MacDonald, in terms of the way the national government is governed, MacDonald essentially takes a very hands-off approach. He gets very ill. His eyesight starts going to the point that he can't even read policy documents.
So that's quite a quick deterioration, is it?
Well, right. He's always had health issues, but they take a massive, a nosedive, essentially.
What is it? Because you said he was born in 66, so he's what...
60s.
Late 60s, is it something then?
Yeah.
Okay.
And as he does that, essentially you start seeing MacDonald. Snowden goes in 32 over imperial preference. There's something called the Ottawa Conference where they negotiate common tariff barrier. The empire doesn't work out. Snowden and Samuel walk out, and Chamberlain then becomes Chancellor. And from this point, Chamberlain and Baldwin are essentially running the national government. What all MacDonald is there to do is essentially to rubber stamp and kind of self-pity himself. Like, if you read his diaries from this period, he's just, woe betide me, I'm the wary Titan who refers to himself as no one carries the burdens I do. Bob Boothby said he once saw him sat by the side of a lake crying and didn't know whether to throw stones at him or shove him in. So this is it takes it's a very sad end to his life. He's not...
Yeah, well, it sounds it. I mean, and it's so... Chamberlain died quite quickly after leaving office, didn't he? Yeah. And MacDonald did. I mean, it's quite a dramatic demise, isn't it?
Yeah. And all three, this is the interesting thing with all three of them, MacDonald, Baldwin and Chamberlain, all three of the interwar prime ministers all were immensely popular at one point, and it wasn't long until they became the most hated men in Britain.
Well, Baldwin in MacDonald in 35 then, what is the popular view? Do we have any sort of gauging of this?
Yeah, so even the literature now, if you trace the literature that was published early on, so you look at Guilty Men by in 40, and then you've got Churchill's Oncoming Storm, his first volume of the Second World War in 1948, they essentially set the tone for future debates about MacDonald in the sense that MacDonald betrayed his own party. Remember, Churchill's working with Attlee in this new government. He's got a lot of respect for Attlee. Churchill really didn't like MacDonald. He really didn't like Baldwin. He really didn't like Chamberlain. So he's got a chip on his shoulder about this stuff. But in 35, you've already got Labour and Ernie Bevan and Arthur Henderson and Greenwood and Citroen all basically throwing mud at MacDonald. And this doesn't stop even after his death.
So is there a little bit of Richard III syndrome creeping in here? Do you know what I mean by that? In the sense that, Richard III, the evil, king, written by the Tudors or written by people who worked for the Tudors. Some would argue that. I know the Richard III Society are big on that. I'm not trying to get into this, but is that then, from what you say, that they're taking over the sort of contemporary or just post-contemporary view of MacDonald and creating this is what we think about him?
Yes, this is another aspect of MacDonald. He didn't get on with any of his colleagues. Henderson, they didn't get on. He used to think Henderson was constantly stealing his limelight. Snowden despised MacDonald. His closest political ally despised him because he viewed MacDonald as vain, egocentric, petty. So by the time MacDonald passes away and all the biographers are coming to consult the primary sources, nearly all of his contemporaries' reflections on MacDonald are all either personally negative or accusing him of treason and betrayal and treachery against Labour. And his reputation has only recently kind of been... There's a great article by this fellow called Shepherd in 2007. Basically, he starts making the comparison between MacDonald and Blair.
Okay.
And moderate Labour.
Is this a revisionism or
Yeah, this
whatever?
is basically the beginning of revisionism, yeah.
Right, so we're into revisionism on MacDonald now, and we're perhaps thinking some of the things. Where are you on MacDonald then? And on the whole thing, I mean, I know...
I mean, I think, his decision to... in effect, throw himself under the bus with the crisis. I don't think he wanted to leave the Labour Party. He'd brought it up. He'd made it electorally successful, but he made the decision in favour of national unity and as a matter of duty. I think that takes a tremendous amount of courage to do that, and I think the fact that he was, racked with guilt all the way until his death. I think it's incredibly
Probably didn't
sad.
help his health issues if he
100%.
did it, really. I mean, would the country have been... It's different. I don't want to get into the counterfactual too much, but if that hadn't have happened, that approach in the early 30s, would have things turned out worse? Is that... I mean, the country's facing significant economic problems.
I think the main issue would be, I think it would have been incredibly beneficial for Labour in retrospect. I don't think Labour would have had... Then again, though, if MacDonald doesn't walk out and take with him a lot of his followers, you don't then get the rise of people like Hugh Dalton and Clement Attlee, right, to the leadership of Labour. These men that would go on to create the first Labour... I'm tripping up there. The first Labour, inverted commas here, government in 45, they wouldn't have risen to power. You would have still had, essentially... It'd been dominated by these I don't know if it's the correct term, but it's referred to as ethical socialism or moral
Yeah,
socialism. I think then what would have happened probably would have been the Tories would have been forced to go with the Liberals, but then you've got the issue of, is the country going to elect a clearly Conservative government to implement austerity cuts? I think one of the
Did MacDonald cope? Well, one of the other resonances with recent history is leaders. There's a couple of them that come to mind. There was one in the UK who was Prime Minister during what we remember as COVID, if you remember that. And then there was one who was President of the United States who dovetailed and lost the election in 2020. And they might look at and say, well, if it wasn't for that, I would be still doing good things as leader. And then you might throw back at them, yeah, but that's the job, isn't it? I mean, it might be quite dramatic, and a pandemic is, not a common thing, hopefully, but that's what you have to deal with. Did MacDonald deal with the big dramatic events in what could be considered a good way? Is that a fair question?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the national government was created with a very clear purpose, and it didn't achieve that purpose. It didn't keep sterling on the gold standard. It didn't essentially keep up the economic orthodox that would have been in Britain essentially since, 1800s. But what his government does engineer is a completely radical overhaul of Britain's, not necessarily its fiscal or like nationalisation, that sort of thing, but its trade policy. I mean, protectionism is brought in essentially. General tariffs implemented. Interest rates are cut. This was viewed, I mean, Snowden basically said that it would reduce the British population to starvation if that happened. So all these myths were kind of proven wrong by the government. It wasn't its intention, but it did do that. And it did get Britain through the economic crisis. By the time Chamberlain gets to the Premiership, Britain's economy is the best in Europe by far. I mean, you can look at German manufacturing and say, well, they're manufacturing well, but if you look at the finances of Germany relative to Britain, Britain's got a much healthier financial situation. Sterling's much stronger than the Reichsmark.
And just that, I mean, I've mentioned it before, but let's maybe just emphasise that nature of working together, the national government, and look, we can stitch this thing together, surely would be that what at least some people would think would be a good thing now.
Well, I suppose it goes to the heart of general political compromise. In national government, it was the case of we're uniting together to save the nation's finances.
Yeah, in a particular time.
Yeah, but then it's also, I think it's also for politicians. You look at with far right, when you've got far right and extremist threats, it's about uniting together, creating consensus, creating a compromise, so that you can defend democracy. It isn't, political compromise, I think, now has broken down, and perhaps we're our politicians today, they're far too ideological about things. And I think what we need more of now is a pragmatism, so that we can work together, and we've got common values that underlie, our whatever I believe on socialism, or liberalism, or conservatism, and those are what we should strive for, those common values, more than the subjective ones.
Terrific. Two things to say before we finish. Mr. Cook, you were fantastic today.
Oh, thank you.
And I think we need to do more of the 20s and 30s.
Yeah.
So we're going to do part 2. This is part 1.
Hey.
I'm not sure what part 2 is going to be, because we have kind of done most of MacDonald here. So but he will maybe feature in a 1930s part 2, because I sense there's quite a bit more to say on the 1930s. So that's first thing. Second thing, Finn, I think you're absolutely spot on there. So we're giving an instruction really that more of our politicians really need to go and look at Ramsay MacDonald again, don't they?
Yes.
And take the positives out of Ramsay. So there you go, everyone. Look at Ramsay. And please, just have a think about that, because there were really important times, weren't they? They were formative, and such a big deal. It seems crazy almost that such a figure, certainly for the first half of the decade, is not really that well known. But there you go. Hopefully, people will know him a little bit more now. Thank you for listening, everybody, and see you next time.
Goodbye.